Welcome to my home office. It's a good time for us to talk about the story of religion. Now, we could start in just talking about sex. I could talk about my sex, you could talk about your sex, and it's not going to happen. In fact, throughout the semester, you're going to hear nothing about my sex or sexuality, and I really prefer to hear nothing about yours. But just for pretendsies, we could. I could tell you exactly what my sex and sexuality are right now. But you see, that's not true. Because my sex and sexuality as it is right at this moment is a part of a long story. The story of Tom Shoemaker's sex and sexuality. You see, I go all the way back to birth, and I've been changing and growing and emerging ever since then, and will continue to do so right to the time I die. And so will you. Your story begins at birth, and your story continues down to where you're at today, and it'll continue to the very end as well. So if I told you what I'm doing or thinking or perceiving at this moment, that's not enough. It doesn't tell you who I am. But at the same time, remember that my sexuality interacts with other human beings along the way in the course of my life. I have been married and I do have children, so there's at least some interaction out there with someone else's story of sexuality. So it just got more complicated. But wait, it gets more complicated yet. My sexuality interacts with all humanity's sexuality. My story, little tiny Tom Shoemaker story, is a part of a much larger story of human sexuality. And that story reaches back 200,000 years ago or so. I didn't invent anything. So my choices as to what I enjoy, what I don't enjoy, what I reject, all of that's kind of been handed to me by nature. Going back 200,000 years ago may not be enough, but at some point we differentiate human sexuality from the sexuality of bonobos and chimpanzees. And we certainly have differentiated it from pigs and porpoises and bugs. So to understand my sexuality means I need to understand the story of mine. I need to understand the story of mine within the story of human sexuality, and I really should understand the story of human sexuality within the context of nature. And by the way, do you notice these two things over my right shoulder here? I want you to pay attention to the one that's on that side. That's going to be important later on. At any rate, getting back to this, the story of sexuality also interacts with another profound story, the story of religion. Now, the story of religion may not reach back as far as the story of sexuality because we don't know when human beings started being religious. But somewhere 10, 20, 30, 40,000 years ago, human beings began to develop a sense of wonder or a sense of awe or a sense of fear and develop systems to try to meet that, to interact with the powers that gave them that awe or that fear. And that's what religion is. You'll see there are PowerPoint presentations of figurines that were created all through that time frame, and we think they have something to do with religiosity, but exactly what we don't know because those people couldn't write. So we have a bunch of little figures and no real sense of what they're doing. And it all begins to change in the Little Ice Age. About 12,000 years ago, the Earth went through this horrible freeze, and we changed and became farmers, and we settled down into villages and then cities. And the earliest temple that we've ever found dates to about 9,000 BCE, about that time frame, and it's in what is now Turkey. And they have figures very much like the figures that we find scattered all over Europe and the Middle East. And so we think there might be some connection. And we know that they have something to do with religion because these are temples. And we find the same kinds of figures buried in the floors of homes. So there's some connection between the individual's personal life and what goes on in a public sphere. But we still don't know what. That requires writing. And that comes along about 5,000 years ago. 200,000 years we've been around, and only about 5,000 years ago did we begin to write things down. And for the first time we get inside their heads. And because we can see what they were thinking, the stories they were telling, we can start to get a sense of what mythic religion is. Mythic religion is the religion that's built around a collection of stories of powers and deities. And there are 5 great mythic traditions. The first is the Mesopotamian tradition between the rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates in what we call Iraq today. And it's the stories of Enki and Enlil and Inanna and Ishtar. And they're all gathered up together, and trust me, it's a wild collection. And about that same time, maybe before, maybe after, over in Egypt, they begin to develop a mythic tradition of their own. And theirs involves Ra and Min and Isis and Osiris and Horus and Anubis and all the rest. And about that same time, a little bit after that, over in India, well, now it's Pakistan, but it used to be in India, in the Indus River Valley, there were great civilizations, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, and they had something. Theirs is harder. They have writing, but we've never been able to decipher it. And just another couple of hundred years after that, over in the Chinese basin between the Yangtze and the Yellow Rivers, a mythic tradition begins to emerge, and writing begins to tell those stories too. Finally, and this one might surprise you, all the way over here in Mesoamerica, in southern Mexico and the Central American region, we have an emerging mythic tradition there about 1,500 years ago too. And we see the Olmec and the Toltec develop into the Maya and the Aztec, and great bodies of myth. And all of these traditions have something, a lot to say about human sexuality. And all of them are affected by and impact the sexual practices of their cultures. But none of them is the religion that we practice today. All of that's happening, but the religions we practice today only date back to about 3,000 years ago. Judaism as we know it, and Hinduism as we know it, emerge about 1000 BCE. And they take the mythic tradition and begin to transform those traditions. And they develop and develop and develop into what we see. And yes, they had something profound and maybe different to say about sexuality. And then from that point, 3,000 years ago, we have what we can call a world religions story. And out of Judaism emerges the Christianity that we know. And out of the mix of Judaism and Christianity, in Arabia emerges Islam. And over in India, out of that mix that is Hinduism, emerges Buddhism and Jainism and Sikhism. And over in China, out of their tradition emerges first a sacrificial system that saw a relationship between heaven and earth. And then out of all of that comes the Confucian perspective and the Taoist tradition. The story of religion is complex. There are a lot of little subplots all the way through, but ultimately they are all part of a single story. If we're going to understand human sexuality and religion, we have to understand those big stream stories. Remember, Christianity as it is today is not the Christianity that was there 2,000 years ago. Islam as it is today is not the Islam that was there 1,400 years ago. Buddhism as it is today is not the Buddhism that was there 2,500 years ago. Each of these traditions has continued to change and grow, and we don't know where they're going. But if we can back up and get a good long sense of how it works, we can hop on at the moment and then write it as far as our lives will take us. I'm hoping that this turns out to be a little bit of fun.